Part 1. The fundamental question. What is the meaning of life? This question has echoed through human consciousness for millennia, whispered in moments of profound joy, and screamed in times of deepest despair. It's a question that has driven philosophers to madness, inspired religious revelations, and motivated scientific discoveries. Yet for all our searching, for all our theories and theologies, the question remains as pressing today as it was when the first human looked up at the stars and wondered why they existed at all. But what if we've been approaching this question wrong? What if the very way we frame it reveals assumptions that lead us astray? Today, we're exploring this ancient question through the lens of existentialism, a philosophical movement that emerged in the turbulent 19th and 20th centuries, offering not just a different answer, but a fundamentally different way of asking the question itself. Traditional philosophy has long sought universal truths, eternal principles that apply to all people in all times. Ancient philosophers like Plato believed in perfect forms that existed beyond our physical world, ideal concepts of justice, beauty, and goodness that we could discover through reason. Medieval thinkers integrated these ideas with religious doctrine, suggesting that life's meaning came from fulfilling God's plan for creation. Even modern secular philosophies often assume there's some objective purpose we can uncover through science, reason, or social analysis. Existentialism shatters this comfortable assumption. It doesn't ask, what is the meaning of life? As if there's a cosmic answer written in the stars, encoded in our DNA, or revealed in sacred texts. Instead, it asks a more radical and more personal question. How do I create meaning in my life? This shift from discovery to creation, from universal to personal, from objective to subjective, changes everything about how we approach human existence. Consider the implications of this reframing. If meaning is something to be discovered, then we're essentially treasure hunters, searching for clues that will lead us to the ultimate prize of understanding our purpose. We might look to religion for divine revelation, to science for natural laws, or to philosophy for logical proofs. But what if there's no treasure to find? What if the map we're following leads nowhere because the destination was never real in the first place? Existentialism suggests that we are not treasure hunters but artists, not archaeologists uncovering ancient truths, but sculptors shaping raw material into meaningful forms. The raw material is our existence itself, our freedom, our choices, our relationships, our mortality. The sculpture is the life we create through how we choose to live. This artistic metaphor is crucial because it captures both the creative potential and the terrifying responsibility of human existence. An artist beginning with a blank canvas faces infinite possibilities. Every brushstroke is both an act of creation and a limitation. Choosing one color means not choosing others. Painting in one corner means leaving other areas empty. The freedom is exhilarating, but it's also paralyzing. How do you know which choice is right when there's no predetermined pattern to follow? The existentialist position emerged from a specific historical context that made traditional answers to life's meaning seem inadequate or even false. The 19th century witnessed unprecedented social upheaval. The Industrial Revolution transformed how people lived and worked. Scientific discoveries challenged religious worldviews. Political revolutions overthrew traditional authorities. Two devastating world wars in the 20th century seemed to reveal the horrific consequences of following charismatic leaders and absolute ideologies. In this context, many traditional sources of meaning appeared either irrelevant or dangerous. If following gods could lead to crusades and inquisitions, if scientific progress could produce weapons of mass destruction, if political movements could result in genocide, then perhaps the problem wasn't finding the right external source of meaning, but relying on external sources at all. The existentialist response wasn't to despair, but to recognize an opportunity. If traditional authorities couldn't provide reliable guidance for living, then individuals would have to take responsibility for creating their own guidance. This wasn't a retreat into solipsism or relativism. Existentialists weren't saying that all choices are equally valid, or that meaning is purely subjective. Instead, they were arguing that meaning emerges from a serious engagement with our freedom and responsibility as conscious beings. This engagement requires what we might call existential courage, the willingness to live without guarantees, to make choices without absolute certainty, to take responsibility without being able to blame others for the consequences. It's easy to follow rules, whether religious, social, or philosophical, then create our own principles. It's more comfortable to believe that our lives have predetermined purposes and to accept the burden of defining our own significance. But existentialism argues that this comfort comes at a tremendous cost. When we surrender our freedom to external authorities, we become less than fully human. We become what Sartre would later call objects rather than subjects, things rather than people. We allow ourselves to be defined by others' expectations rather than our own authentic choices. The shift from asking, what is the meaning of life, to asking, how do I create meaning in my life, also changes our relationship to doubt and uncertainty. Traditional approaches to meaning often treat doubt as a problem to be solved, uncertainty as a weakness to be overcome. Religious faith promises certainty through revelation. Scientific materialism promises certainty through empirical evidence. Political ideologies promise certainty through social analysis. Existentialism embraces doubt and uncertainty as fundamental aspects of the human condition. We are beings who can question our own existence, who are aware of our awareness, who can imagine alternative ways of living. This self-consciousness brings with it an inevitable uncertainty about who we are and what we should do. Rather than seeing this as a flaw to be corrected, existentialism sees it as the source of our unique dignity and responsibility. The question of life's meaning becomes not what should I do, but who do I choose to become? It's not about finding the right answer, but about living in a way that honestly confronts a question. The meaning emerges not from the conclusion we reach, but from the integrity with which we engage the search itself. This approach requires us to distinguish between two very different types of questions. Some questions have answers that can be discovered through investigation. What is the capital of France? Has a factual answer. How does photosynthesis work? Can be explained through scientific research. But other questions don't have discoverable answers because they're not really asking for information. They're asking for decisions about how to live. What is the meaning of life? Belongs to the second category. It's not a request for information, but an expression of a need to decide what to value, how to live, what kind of person to become. The existentialist insight is that treating these decision questions as if they were information questions leads to confusion and false answers. When we ask, what is the meaning of life? As if it were an information question, we expect to find the answer outside ourselves, in holy books, scientific theories, philosophical systems, or cultural traditions. When we ask it as a decision question, we recognize that the answer must come from our own choices and commitments, even though these choices may be informed by external sources. This doesn't make existentialism a purely individualistic philosophy. Our choices always take place in relationship with others, within social contexts, as part of historical moments. The meaning we create is shaped by our connections, communities, and culture, but the ultimate responsibility for integration, for deciding what aspect of our heritage to embrace and what to reject, remains our own. The existentialist approach to meaning also challenges us to think differently about success and failure, right and wrong, good and evil. These categories don't disappear, but they become questions to be worked out through living rather than principles to be applied from outside. We create our understanding of what constitutes a successful life by how we choose to live. We develop our moral intuitions through engaging seriously with our freedom and its consequences. This creates what we might call an experimental approach to meaning. Like scientists testing hypotheses, we test our values and commitments through living them out. Like artists developing their vision, we refine our understanding of meaning through practice and reflection. The difference is that the experiment is our life itself, and we can't step outside it to observe the results objectively. The fundamental question, then, is not what is the meaning of life, but how shall I live? Not what is my purpose, but what purposes will I choose to pursue? Not why do I exist, but what will I make of my existence? These reformulations don't make the questions easier to answer, but they locate the answers in the right place, not in external authorities or universal principles, but in the lived experience of conscious, choosing, responsible human beings. As we embark on this exploration of existentialist approaches to meaning, we're not looking for final answers or ultimate truths. We're examining tools for thinking, frameworks for choosing, ways of understanding what it means to be authentically human in a world that offers no guarantees. The goal is not to solve the question of life's meaning once and for all, but to engage with it more honestly, more courageously, and more creatively. The journey we're beginning recognizes that the question of meaning is not a problem to be solved, but conditioned to be lived. And in that living, with all its uncertainty, responsibility, and creative potential, we discover not the meaning of life in general, but the meaning of our particular, irreplaceable, freely chosen existence. Part 2. The absence of inherent meaning. Existentialism begins with what might seem like the most depressing premise imaginable. The universe has no inherent meaning. There is no cosmic purpose written into the fabric of reality, no divine plan unfolding through history, no natural law that assigns roles and purposes to human beings. We exist in what Albert Camus called an indifferent universe, a vast expanse of matter and energy that operates according to physical laws but offers no moral guidance, no existential comfort, no built-in significance for human life. But here's the radical insight that distinguishes existentialism from nihilism. This absence of inherent meaning is not a cause for despair, but the foundation of human freedom and dignity. The universe's indifference to human purposes doesn't diminish us. It liberates us to become creators of our own significance. To understand this counterintuitive claim, we need to examine what existentialists mean by inherent meaning, and why its absence might actually be good news for human beings. Inherent meaning would be purpose or significance that exists independently of human consciousness, choice, and activity. It would be meaning that we discover rather than create, meaning that exists whether we recognize it or not, meaning that makes certain ways of living objectively right and others objectively wrong. Throughout most of human history, people have assumed that such inherent meaning exists. Ancient mythologies told stories of gods who created humans for specific purposes, to serve them, to populate the earth, to play roles in cosmic dramas. Religious traditions develop elaborate theologies explaining how human life fits into divine plans. Even secular philosophies often assume that nature, reason, or history pointed toward particular ways of organizing society and individual lives. The 19th century began to shake these assumptions. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution suggested that human beings emerged through natural selection rather than divine creation, that our characteristics develop for survival advantages rather than cosmic purposes. Karl Marx argued that religious and philosophical ideas about inherent meaning were often ideological justifications for economic and political systems that benefited the powerful at the expense of the oppressed. Friedrich Nietzsche captured this historical moment with his famous declaration that God is dead. This wasn't primarily a theological claim about whether divine beings exist, but a cultural observation about the declining authority of traditional sources of meaning in modern life. The old certainties were crumbling. The traditional frameworks for understanding human purpose were losing their power to convince and guide. Many people experience this cultural shift as a crisis. If there's no God to provide meaning, no natural purpose to fulfill, no historical destiny to realize, then what's the point of anything? This anxiety led some toward desperate attempts to revive old certainties, others toward the nihilistic conclusion that nothing matters at all. Existentialism offered a third alternative. What if the absence of predetermined meaning is precisely what makes human life valuable and significant? What if meaning is not diminished, but enhanced when it becomes a human creation rather than a cosmic given? Jean-Paul Sartre articulated this insight through his famous claim that existence precedes essence. To understand what this means, consider how we normally think about manufactured objects. A hammer is designed with a specific purpose in mind, to drive nails. Its essence, its purpose, its meaning is determined before it's created. The hammer exists to fulfill a predetermined function. Traditional views of human meaning worked similarly. God, nature, or reason determined what humans were for before creating or evolving them. Human essence, our purpose, our proper function, our meaning, preceded our existence. We were created to serve God, or to be rational animals, or to build just societies, or to seek happiness, or to reproduce our genes. Sartre argued that this gets the relationship backward for human beings. We exist first as conscious, choosing, free beings, and only then do we determine what we are, what we value, what purposes we pursue. Our existence, our concrete, lived, choosing existence, precedes any essence or purpose we might develop. This reversal has profound implications. If a hammer fails to drive nails effectively, we can say objectively that it's a bad hammer because it fails to fulfill its predetermined purpose. But if human beings exist before they have any predetermined purpose, then there's no objective standard by which to judge whether we're succeeding or failing at being human. We must create our own standards, define our own purposes, establish our own criteria for success. This doesn't mean that all purposes are equally valid or that standards are purely arbitrary. It means that purposes and standards emerge from human activity rather than being imposed from outside. We create values through our choices, develop purposes through our commitments, establish standards through our practices and relationships. The absence of inherent meaning also helps explain why human consciousness is so different from the consciousness we might attribute to other animals. A lion doesn't seem to experience anxiety about whether it's living up to its potential as a lion. It follows its instincts, seeks food and mates, responds to threats and opportunities. Its behavior is largely determined by its nature. Human beings, by contrast, are constantly questioning their own existence, imagining alternative ways of living, feeling anxiety about whether they're making the right choices. We can't simply follow our nature because we don't have a fixed nature in the way that lions do. We have tendencies, capacities, biological drives, but these don't determine our choices in the way that instincts determine animal behavior. This capacity for self-questioning and self-creation is both the source of human dignity and the cause of human anxiety. We are, in Sartre's words, condemned to be free. We must choose not only what to do, but who to be. We must create not only our actions, but our values. We must determine not only our goals, but our criteria for judging whether those goals are worthwhile. The absence of inherent meaning reveals itself most clearly in moments of profound choice, when we must decide between competing values or ways of life. If there were objective, inherent meanings built into the universe, these decisions would be matters of discovery rather than creation. We would need to figure out what the universe requires rather than deciding what we value. But anyone who has faced truly difficult choices knows that this isn't how moral decision-making actually works. Should I pursue a career that makes me happy or one that helps others? Should I prioritize loyalty to family or commitment to principles? Should I focus on personal growth or social responsibility? These questions don't have correct answers waiting to be discovered. They require us to decide what kind of person we want to be, what kinds of values we want to embody, what kind of purposes we want to pursue. The absence of inherent meaning also explains why human beings are capable of such creativity and innovation. If we were created to fulfill predetermined purposes, then the best we could do would be to fulfill those purposes efficiently. But because we exist without predetermined purposes, we're free to imagine new ways of living, create new forms of art, develop new types of relationships, establish new kinds of communities. This creative capacity comes with responsibility. When artists create paintings, they can't blame their brushes if the results are ugly. When writers create stories, they can't blame their pens if the plots are boring. Similarly, when human beings create meanings and values, they can't blame God, nature, or society if the results are unsatisfying or harmful. The recognition that the universe lacks inherent meaning doesn't make morality impossible, but it does change how we understand moral obligation. Instead of following predetermined commandments or natural laws, we must take responsibility for developing and justifying our moral commitments. Instead of conforming to cosmic purposes, we must create purposes worthy of our commitment. This creates what existentialists call the human condition, a state of radical freedom that can feel both exhilarating and terrifying. We are free to become almost anything we can imagine, but we must bear full responsibility for what we choose to become. We are not constrained by predetermined purposes, but neither can we rely on predetermined purposes to guide our choices. Simone de Beauvoir captured this condition beautifully when she wrote about the ambiguity of human existence. We are simultaneously free and constrained, creative and limited, individual and social, meaningful and insignificant. We exist in a universe that doesn't care about our purposes, yet we are beings whose essence is to create purposes. We are finite creatures with infinite aspirations, mortal beings who seek eternal significance. This ambiguity isn't a problem to be solved, but a fundamental characteristic of human existence that must be acknowledged and embraced. The attempt to escape ambiguity by finding absolute foundations for meaning leads to what existentialists call bad faith, the denial of our freedom and responsibility through false appeals to external authorities. The absence of inherent meaning also helps us understand why human beings are so deeply social. If meanings and values were built into the universe, we might discover them through individual contemplation or scientific investigation. But because meanings and values emerge from human activity, they develop through our interactions with others. We create significance together through relationships, communities, and shared projects. Yet this social dimension of meaning creation doesn't eliminate individual responsibility. Even when we adopt values from our families, cultures, or traditions, we must still choose which aspects to embrace, how to interpret them, and how to apply them in our particular circumstances. The meanings we inherit from others become authentically our own only when we consciously affirm them through our choices and actions. The recognition that the universe lacks inherent meaning can initially feel disorienting and frightening. Many people's first response is to search for substitute authorities, charismatic leaders, rigid ideologies, fundamentalist religions, or scientific theories that promise to restore the certainty that traditional sources of meaning once provided. But existentialism suggests that this search for substitute authorities misses the real opportunity that the absence of inherent meaning creates. Instead of looking for new external sources of predetermined purpose, we can embrace our role as creators of meaning. Instead of seeking cosmic validation for our choices, we can take responsibility for making choices worthy of our commitment. This shift from seeking meaning to creating meaning doesn't eliminate the possibility of error or regret. We can create meanings that prove unsatisfying or harmful. We can commit to purposes that we later recognize as shallow or destructive. But these mistakes become learning opportunities rather than cosmic failures. They help us refine our understanding of what kinds of meanings are worth creating and what kinds of purposes are worth pursuing. The absence of inherent meaning ultimately reveals the radical dignity of human existence. We are not puppets dancing to cosmic strings, not cogs in divine machines, not products following natural programs. We are conscious, choosing, creative beings capable of bringing significance into an indifferent universe. The meaning we create may be finite, temporary, and uncertain, but it is genuinely our own. And in a universe without predetermined purposes, that may be the most meaningful achievement of all. Part 3. Authenticity as a foundation. If the universe provides no inherent meaning and we must create our own significance, then the crucial question becomes how we create meaning that is genuinely our own rather than merely borrowed from others. This question leads us to perhaps the most important concept in existentialist philosophy, authenticity. But authenticity, as existentialists understand it, is far more complex and demanding than popular culture might suggest. Authenticity is not about being true to yourself in some mystical sense, as if there were a predetermined true self waiting to be discovered. Remember, existentialism rejects the idea that humans have fixed essences or natures. Instead, authenticity is about taking full ownership of your choices and their consequences, living in accordance with values and purposes that emerge from your own reflection and commitment rather than conforming to external expectations or social pressures. The concept of authenticity emerged from existentialist analysis of how people typically avoid the anxiety and responsibility that comes with genuine freedom. Most of us, most of the time, live what Sartre called inauthentic lives. Not because we're bad people, but because authentic living is extraordinarily difficult and demanding. Soren Kierkegaard, often considered the father of existentialism, was among the first to explore this dynamic systematically. Writing in 19th century Denmark, Kierkegaard observed how social conformity allowed individuals to avoid the difficult work of becoming themselves. He distinguished between living as the single individual and living as part of the crowd. The crowd, for Kierkegaard, wasn't necessarily a physical group of people. It was a mode of existence in which we define ourselves through external roles, expectations, and identities rather than through our own choices and commitments. When we live as part of the crowd, we become what one does rather than what I choose to do. We follow social scripts rather than writing our own stories. Consider how this works in practice. Someone might choose a career because it's what their family expects, what their social class typically pursues, or what society rewards financially. They might adopt political opinions because they're associated with their profession, their community, or their generation. They might even choose personal relationships based on social compatibility rather than genuine connection. None of these choices is necessarily wrong, but they become inauthentic when they're made unreflectively, when the person treats external expectations as if they were cosmic commandments that must be obeyed. Authenticity requires acknowledging that even socially approved choices are still choices, and taking responsibility for making them consciously rather than automatically. This is more challenging than it might initially appear, because social expectations often seem so natural and inevitable that we don't recognize them as expectations at all. They become what Sartre called the given aspect of our situation that we treat as fixed constraints rather than as circumstances that we can choose to accept, modify, or reject. For example, someone born into a particular social class might assume that certain opportunities are simply unavailable to them. Certain behaviors are inappropriate. Certain aspirations are unrealistic. These assumptions might be accurate descriptions of social reality, but they become inauthentic when the person treats them as metaphysical truths rather than as social arrangements that can potentially be challenged or changed. Authenticity requires what we might call existential skepticism, a willingness to question assumptions that most people take for granted, including assumptions about what's possible, what's appropriate, what's valuable, and what's meaningful. This doesn't mean rejecting all social norms or traditions, but rather examining them critically and choosing which ones to embrace based on their alignment with our own values and purposes. But here's where authenticity becomes genuinely difficult. We can only develop our own values and purposes through engagement with the world, including the social world with its expectations and pressures. We don't create ourselves in isolation. We become who we are through relationships, communities, cultural influences, and historical circumstances. The challenge is to interact with these external forces in ways that shape us authentically rather than simply determining us. Simone de Beauvoir explored this challenge through her analysis of women's situations in mid-20th century society. She argued that women were often encouraged to define themselves primarily through their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, mothers, rather than as individuals with their own projects and purposes. This wasn't necessarily because men consciously oppressed women, though that sometimes happened, but because social structures made it easier for women to accept predetermined roles than to create their own identities. De Beauvoir's insight extends beyond gender to any situation where people are encouraged to define themselves primarily through external roles rather than internal commitments. We might be encouraged to see ourselves primarily as employees rather than as people who happen to work, as consumers rather than as people who happen to purchase things, as members of particular groups rather than as individuals who happen to share certain characteristics with others. Authenticity requires maintaining what we might call existential distance from our roles, acknowledging that we play them without allowing them to define us completely. A teacher who lives authentically recognizes that teaching is something they do, not something they are. They can be committed to teaching excellence while maintaining the freedom to question teaching methods, educational systems, or even the value of education itself. This existential distance doesn't require cynicism or detachment. In fact, authentic commitment often involves deeper engagement than inauthentic conformity because it's chosen rather than assumed. The authentic teacher might care more about education, not less, because they've consciously chosen to value it rather than simply accepting it as given. Sartre introduced the concept of bad faith to describe the various ways people avoid authentic living. Bad faith involves denying either our freedom or our responsibility, pretending either that we have no choice in our circumstances or that we bear no responsibility for our choices. The denial of freedom appears in statements like, "I had no choice, that's just how I am, I was only following orders," or "society made me do it." While external constraints certainly exist and can be very powerful, bad faith involves treating these constraints as absolute rather than acknowledging whatever freedom remains available. The denial of responsibility appears in statements like, "I didn't mean for that to happen, I was just being myself, I couldn't help it," or "That's not who I really am." Bad faith involves treating our actions as if they were natural events that happened to us rather than choices we made and must own. Both forms of bad faith provide psychological comfort by reducing the anxiety that comes with freedom and responsibility. If we have no choice, then we can't be blamed for making wrong decisions. If we bear no responsibility, then we don't need to worry about the consequences of our actions. But this comfort comes at the cost of authenticity and, ultimately, of genuine meaning. Authentic living requires what Kierkegaard called the anxiety of freedom, the uncomfortable recognition that we must choose without absolute certainty about what's right, that we must act without guarantee of success, that we must take responsibility without being able to control all outcomes. This anxiety is different from neurotic worry or pathological fear. It's the appropriate emotional response to recognizing the scope of our freedom and responsibility. Kierkegaard described it as the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes from standing at the edge of possibility and recognizing that we must choose which way to jump. Many people try to avoid this anxiety by seeking external authorities that will make their choices for them or by following rigid rules that eliminate uncertainty. But existentialism suggests that this avoidance ultimately leads to a diminished form of human existence. We become less than fully human when we surrender our capacity for authentic choice. Authenticity also involves accepting what existentialists call thrownness, the recognition that we didn't choose the circumstances into which we were born, but must take responsibility for how we respond to those circumstances. We don't choose our families, our cultures, our historical moments, or many of the opportunities and constraints that shape our lives. But we do choose how to interpret these given circumstances and how to act within them. This creates an interesting paradox. We become most authentically ourselves by acknowledging how much of ourselves we didn't choose. We don't choose our genetic inheritance, our childhood experiences, our cultural background, or our historical moment. But authenticity emerges precisely from how we choose to relate to these unchosen aspects of our existence. Someone born into poverty doesn't choose that circumstance, but they can choose how to respond to it, whether to accept it as inevitable, to work to change their individual situation, to fight for systemic change, or to find meaning despite economic constraints. None of these responses is automatically authentic. Authenticity depends on whether the response emerges from genuine reflection and choice rather than from social pressure or unreflective reaction. Martin Heidegger contributed to existentialist thinking about authenticity through his analysis of how people typically lose themselves in what he called the they-self. According to Heidegger, most of us most of the time exist in a mode where we do what one does, think what one thinks, value what one values. We become indistinguishable from the anonymous social average. This isn't necessarily bad. Social cooperation requires some degree of conformity, and many social norms reflect accumulated wisdom about how to live well. But it becomes problematic when we lose the capacity to distinguish between what we genuinely choose and what we simply absorb from our social environment. Heidegger suggested that authentic existence requires what he called resoluteness, a kind of decisive commitment to our own possibilities that emerges from serious reflection on our situation, our mortality, and our responsibility. Resoluteness isn't stubbornness or rigidity. It's the capacity to commit ourselves fully to choices that we've made consciously and reflectively. But authenticity presents us with final paradox. We can't achieve it by trying to achieve it directly. Someone who is constantly asking, "Am I being authentic?" is probably being inauthentic because they're more concerned with meeting a standard of authenticity than with engaging genuinely with their actual situation and choices. Authenticity emerges indirectly from serious engagement with the questions and challenges that life presents us. It develops through what we might call existential practice, the ongoing work of examining our assumptions, questioning our habits, reflecting on our values, and taking responsibility for our choices. This practice doesn't guarantee that we'll make perfect choices or live perfectly meaningful lives, but it does ensure that whatever meaning we create will be genuinely our own rather than borrowed from others. And in a universe without predetermined purposes, that ownership of our own meaning-making might be the most authentic achievement possible. The foundation of existentialist meaning-making, then, is not the discovery of who we really are, but the ongoing creation of who we choose to become. Authenticity is not a destination we reach, but a mode of traveling, a way of engaging with our freedom and responsibility that honors both our individual dignity and our interconnection with others. It's a foundation upon which all genuine meaning must be built. Part 4. Creating values through choice. If there are no predetermined values or universal moral codes inscribed in the fabric of reality, then how do we determine what's right and wrong, good and bad, worthwhile and meaningless? This question strikes at the heart of human moral experience and leads us to one of existentialism's most radical insights. We create values through our choices and actions rather than discovering them through investigation or receiving them through revelation. This doesn't mean that values are arbitrary, relative, or purely subjective. Instead, it means that values emerge from serious engagement with our freedom, our relationships, and our recognition of what it means to be human in a world shared with others. When you choose to help someone in distress, you're not just performing a kind act. You're declaring through your action that kindness has value, that suffering matters, that human beings deserve care and consideration. To understand how this value creation works, we need to examine what existentialists mean by choice and why they consider the fundamental expression of human existence. Choice, in the existentialist sense, isn't merely the selection between predetermined options, like choosing between vanilla and chocolate ice cream. It's the more profound activity of determining what kind of options are worth considering, what kinds of criteria matter for evaluation, what kinds of outcomes we hope to achieve. Every significant choice involves multiple levels of decision-making. When someone chooses a career, they're not just selecting from available jobs. They're implicitly deciding what kind of work has value, what kind of contributions to society matter, what kind of personal satisfaction are worth pursuing, what kinds of relationships they want to have with colleagues and clients. These deeper decisions about values and priorities often remain unconscious, but they shape the choice more powerfully than practical considerations like salary or location. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this dynamic with his famous claim that, in choosing for ourselves, we choose for all humanity. This sounds grandiose, but Sartre's point was both profound and practical. When we make significant choices, we're inevitably making implicit claims about how human beings in similar circumstances should act. Our choices reflect our beliefs about what kinds of lives are worth living, what kinds of relationships are worth pursuing, what kinds of activities are worth doing. Consider someone who chooses to become a teacher despite the modest pay and challenging working conditions. Through this choice, they're implicitly suggesting that education has value, that young people deserve attention and care, that the transmission of knowledge and skills across generations is important work. They're not necessarily claiming that everyone should become teachers, but they are claiming that the values expressed through teaching, care for others' development, commitment to learning, service to future generations, deserve recognition and respect. This doesn't mean that individual choices automatically create universal obligations. Someone's decision to value art doesn't require everyone else to become artists. But it does mean that our choices have moral significance beyond their personal consequences. They contribute to the ongoing human conversation about what kinds of lives are worth living and what kinds of values are worth embodying. The existentialist understanding of value creation helps explain why moral disagreements can be so intense and why they often seem to involve more than different opinions about particular issues. When people disagree about abortion, capital punishment, economic policy, or environmental protection, they're not just disagreeing about practical strategies. They're disagreeing about fundamental values, about what kinds of beings humans are, what kinds of relationships we should have with each other, what kinds of responsibilities we bear for others' welfare. These disagreements can be resolved through appeal to external authorities because the authorities themselves embody particular value commitments. Religious texts, philosophical systems, scientific theories, and political ideologies all express choices about what matters most, what deserves priority, what constitutes legitimate evidence for moral claims. Choosing among these authorities is itself a value-creating choice that can't be made on neutral grounds. This doesn't lead to moral relativism because not all value-creating choices are equally serious, thoughtful, or consistent with the fundamental conditions of human existence. Existentialism provides criteria for evaluating value-creating choices, even while rejecting external standards imposed from outside human experience. The first criterion is authenticity, which we explored in the previous section. Values that emerge from authentic choice-making, from serious reflection on our freedom and responsibility, have a different quality than values adopted unreflectively from social pressure, tradition, or authority. Authentic values are genuinely our own because we've consciously chosen to embrace them after considering alternatives. The second criterion is what we might call existential consistency. Since human beings are fundamentally free, choosing, responsible creatures, values that deny or undermine these characteristics work against the basic structure of human existence. A value system that treats people as objects to be manipulated rather than subjects to be respected violates the fundamental nature of human beings as conscious, choosing agents. Simone de Beauvoir developed this insight through her analysis of oppression and liberation. She argued that we cannot be truly free while others remain oppressed, because freedom is not a possession that individuals can hoard, but a condition that emerges through relationships among equals. When we support systems that deny others freedom, through racism, sexism, economic exploitation, or political tyranny, we undermine the very conditions that make our own freedom possible. This creates what de Beauvoir called the ethics of ambiguity. We exist in situations that are always partially constraining and partially open, always involving both individual choice and social relationships, always requiring both self-assertion and recognition of others. The values we create must acknowledge this ambiguity, rather than trying to escape it through false simplifications. The third criterion involves what existentialists call taking responsibility for consequences. When we create values through our choices, we become accountable not only for our intentions, but also for the reasonably foreseeable results of our actions. This doesn't require omniscience or perfect prediction, but it does require serious consideration of how our value-creating choices affect others and ourselves. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who developed existentialist insights from his experience in concentration camps, demonstrated how value creation can occur even under the most constrained circumstances. Even when external freedom was almost completely eliminated, individuals retained what Frankl called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose their attitude toward their situation. Frankl observed that those who survived the camps with their humanity intact were often those who found ways to create meaning within their suffering. Some focus on protecting fellow prisoners, others on preserving memories of loved ones, still others on maintaining hope for future contributions to the world. These weren't predetermined meanings, but meanings created through conscious choice in response to extreme circumstances. The values that emerged from these choices, compassion, loyalty, hope, dignity, weren't arbitrary or purely personal. They reflected deep insights about what it means to be human under conditions that threaten to destroy humanity itself. They were values worth creating precisely because they affirmed human dignity in situations designed to eliminate it. This example illustrates how value creation works in less extreme circumstances. We create values by choosing how to respond to the challenges and opportunities that our situations present. A parent creates values through choosing how to balance nurturing with discipline, protection with independence, guidance with freedom. An employee creates values through choosing how to balance personal advancement with colleague support, individual achievement with teamwork, efficiency with quality. These aren't decisions that can be made once and then followed automatically. They require ongoing choice and re-choice as situations change and our understanding develops. The values we create through parenthood, work, friendship, citizenship, and other roles must be continually renewed through fresh choices that take account of new circumstances and deeper insight. The existentialist understanding of value creation also helps explain why moral education is so challenging. We can't simply transmit values from one generation to the next like factual information, because values must be chosen to be genuinely held. We can expose young people to examples of value-creating choices, help them understand the consequences of different approaches, and support them in developing their capacity for authentic reflection. But ultimately, they must create their own values through their own choices. This creates what we might call the paradox of moral guidance. Parents, teachers, and other mentors who care about young people's moral development want to help them make good choices. But the very activity of making choices authentically requires a kind of independence that external guidance can support but never replace. The most valuable moral education may be that which teaches people how to choose thoughtfully rather than what to choose specifically. The social dimension of value creation becomes particularly important when we consider how individual choices aggregate into cultural and political movements. The civil rights movement, for example, wasn't created through a single decision by a charismatic leader. It emerged from countless individual choices by people who decided that racial equality had value worth pursuing despite significant personal costs. These individual value-creating choices reinforced and amplified each other, creating new possibilities for action and new understandings of what racial justice might look like. The values weren't predetermined, but emerged through the process of struggle itself. Participants discovered what they valued most deeply by choosing to act on their convictions despite uncertain outcomes. Similarly, environmental movements emerged from individual choices to value ecological sustainability, often made by people who might not initially have considered themselves environmentalists. Someone chooses to change their consumption patterns, their transportation methods, their political activities because they've decided that future generations deserve a livable planet. Through these choices, they create and express environmental values that then influence others' choices. The existentialist approach to value creation also illuminates why moral progress is possible without assuming objective moral truths waiting to be discovered. Moral progress occurs when people create values that more fully acknowledge human freedom, dignity, and interdependence. The abolition of slavery represented moral progress not because it aligned with eternal moral laws, but because it better expressed the fundamental insight that human beings are subjects who deserve respect rather than objects to be owned. This understanding of moral progress as value creation rather than value discovery has practical implications for how we approach contemporary moral challenges. Issues like biotechnology, artificial intelligence, global economic inequality, and climate change can't be resolved by consulting traditional authorities because these authorities develop in response to different challenges and opportunities. Instead, we must create new values appropriate to our current situation through serious engagement with the challenges themselves. We must consider what kinds of beings we want to be, what kinds of relationships we want to have with each other and with nature, what kinds of future we want to create for those who come after us. This doesn't make moral decision-making easier, but it does make it more honest. Instead of pretending that moral truths exist independently of human choice and commitment, we acknowledge that we must take responsibility for creating the values that will guide our individual lives and our collective future. The creative aspect of value formation also explains why moral disagreements often feel like such high-stakes conflicts. When people disagree about values, they're not just disagreeing about abstract principles. They're disagreeing about what kinds of human beings we should strive to become, what kind of communities we should build, what kinds of world we should create. These disagreements can't be resolved through neutral appeal to facts because the facts themselves become meaningful only within frameworks that embody particular values. Statistical information about economic inequality becomes relevant to policy decisions only if we value economic fairness. Scientific data about climate change motivates action only if we value environmental sustainability. Historical evidence about the effects of different social policies influences current choices only if we value learning from past experience. The existentialist insight is that we can't avoid making value-creating choices, but we can make them more consciously and more responsibly. We can acknowledge that our choices express values rather than merely implementing predetermined principles. We can take responsibility for the values we create rather than pretending they come from external authorities. We can remain open to revising our values as we gain new experience and deeper understanding. Most importantly, we can recognize that creating values through choice is not a burden to be endured, but an opportunity to be embraced. It's the distinctive capacity that makes us human, the ability to imagine alternatives to current conditions, to commit ourselves to purposes that transcend immediate self-interest, to take responsibility for contributing to the ongoing human experiment in creating lives worth living. In a universe without predetermined purposes, this capacity for value creation becomes our greatest achievement and our deepest responsibility. Through our choices, we don't just live our values, we create them moment by moment, decision by decision, in the ongoing human effort to make existence meaningful. Part 5. Embracing anxiety and absurdity. Existentialism doesn't promise that creating your own meaning will be comfortable, pleasant, or psychologically easy. In fact, it acknowledges that freedom brings anxiety, that consciousness generates uncertainty, and that life often feels fundamentally absurd. Rather than seeing these experiences as problems to be solved or symptoms to be cured, existentialism suggests there are inevitable and even valuable aspects of authentic human existence that must be acknowledged, understood, and ultimately embraced. This embrace of difficulty sets existentialism apart from many other philosophical and therapeutic approaches that promise to eliminate suffering, uncertainty, or psychological distress. Existentialism doesn't offer techniques for becoming happier, more confident, or more at peace. Instead, it offers frameworks for understanding why certain forms of distress are appropriate responses to the human condition and how we can live meaningfully with and through them. The anxiety that existentialism identifies as central to human experience is not the pathological anxiety that interferes with daily functioning or the neurotic worry that focuses on specific threats and uncertainties. Instead, it's what Soren Kierkegaard called the anxiety of freedom, or the dizziness of freedom, the fundamental unease that comes from recognizing the full scope of our choices and their consequences. Kierkegaard illustrated this anxiety through the metaphor of standing at the edge of a cliff. The anxiety we feel isn't primarily fear that we might accidentally fall. Cliffs can be navigated safely with proper precautions. The deeper anxiety comes from recognizing that we could choose to jump. We become dizzy not from the height, but from the recognition of our own freedom to make decisions that would radically alter or end our existence. This existential anxiety permeates human life because we are constantly standing at metaphorical cliffs, facing choices that could fundamentally change who we are and how we live. Should I commit to this relationship or preserve my independence? Should I pursue this career path or explore alternatives? Should I start a family or focus on other forms of contribution? Should I remain in my familiar community or venture into unknown territory? Each significant choice involved an element of what Kierkegaard called the leap, a movement beyond rational calculation into uncertain territory. We can gather information, consult advisors, and weigh options, but ultimately we must choose without complete knowledge of outcomes. This uncertainty is not a temporary inconvenience that better planning can eliminate. It's a structural feature of human existence that stems from our nature as free, choosing, temporal beings. The anxiety of freedom reveals itself most clearly in moments of major life transitions, graduating from school, beginning careers, forming partnerships, becoming parents, facing illness, confronting mortality. These transitions force us to acknowledge that we are choosing not just what to do, but who to become, and that these choices can be made with certainty about their long-term consequences. But existential anxiety also appears in subtler forms throughout daily life. It emerges when we question assumptions that most people take for granted, when we recognize that our familiar routines and relationships are choices rather than necessities, when we become aware of possibilities we're not pursuing. Someone who suddenly realizes they could quit their job, leave their city, or fundamentally change their lifestyle might experience a wave of anxiety that has nothing to do with practical concerns and everything to do with recognizing their freedom. Modern culture often treats such anxiety as a problem to be eliminated through therapy, medication, distraction, or lifestyle changes. Existentialism suggests instead that this anxiety signals something important. We are taking our freedom seriously and refusing to hide from the responsibilities that come with consciousness and choice. This doesn't mean that all anxiety is healthy or that we should seek out distressing experiences. Clinical anxiety disorders require appropriate treatment, and unnecessary suffering serves no constructive purpose. But the anxiety that comes from recognizing our freedom and responsibility shouldn't be medicated or rationalized away because it connects us with fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. Albert Camus expanded existentialist thinking about difficulty through his analysis of the absurd. For Camus, the absurd isn't a quality that belongs to particular situations or experiences, but rather the fundamental relationship between human beings and the world we inhabit. We are creatures who seek meaning, purpose, and rational explanation, but we exist in a universe that offers no ultimate answers to our deepest questions. The absurd emerges from this collision between human need and cosmic silence. We ask, why do I exist? And the universe provides no response. We seek justice, and natural disasters kill indiscriminately. We pursue happiness, and suffering appears randomly. We build civilizations, and time eventually erases them. We love deeply, and death separates us from those we cherish. Camus illustrated this condition through the myth of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he reached the summit. This punishment was considered particularly cruel, not because of its physical demands, but because of its apparent meaninglessness. Sisyphus could never complete his task, never achieve lasting success, never rest in the satisfaction of accomplishment. Yet Camus argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. This wasn't wishful thinking or denial of his circumstances. Instead, Camus suggested that Sisyphus could find meaning in the struggle itself, in the act of continuing despite futility, in maintaining his dignity and humanity even under absurd conditions. The happiness Camus imagined wasn't the cheerful contentment of someone whose desires have been satisfied, but rather the deeper satisfaction that comes from authentic engagement with one's actual situation. Sisyphus could become happy by accepting his task without illusions, by choosing to push the boulder not because it would achieve some ultimate goal, but because pushing was what he had to do and how he would express his humanity. This Sisyphean happiness becomes a model for authentic human existence. We live in a world that doesn't provide ultimate meaning or guarantee success for our efforts. We pursue goals that time will eventually erase, build relationships that death will eventually sever, create works that entropy will eventually destroy. Yet we can find profound satisfaction in the quality of our engagement with these temporary and uncertain projects. The key insight is that meaning doesn't require permanence, success doesn't require guaranteed outcomes, and satisfaction doesn't require the elimination of difficulty. We can create meaningful lives by choosing to engage fully with our circumstances, whatever they might be, rather than by waiting for circumstances that will make such engagement easy or guaranteed. This approach to absurdity helps explain why existentialism doesn't promise happiness in any conventional sense. Someone who has embraced the absurd condition might experience deep satisfaction, but they're unlikely to experience uncomplicated joy or carefree contentment. They remain aware that their projects are temporary, their relationships are vulnerable, their achievements are finite. This awareness creates a kind of melancholy that coexists with engagement and satisfaction. Jean-Paul Sartre contributed another dimension to existentialist thinking about difficult emotions through his analysis of anguish. While Kierkegaardian anxiety focuses on the dizziness of freedom and Camusian absurdity focuses on the meaninglessness of ultimate outcomes, Sartrean anguish focuses on the weight of responsibility for our choices and their consequences. Sartre distinguished between fear, which responds to external threats, and anguish, which responds to the recognition of our own freedom and responsibility. We feel fear when facing dangers we might not survive. We feel anguish when recognizing that we must choose how to respond to those dangers, and that our choices will have consequences not only for ourselves but potentially for others. A parent facing a child's serious illness experiences both fear and anguish. Fear about the child's welfare and anguish about making treatment decisions without certainty about outcomes. A student choosing a college major experiences anguish not just about their own future, but about the kind of person they're choosing to become and the kinds of contributions they'll make to the world. Sartrean anguish intensifies when we recognize that our choices express implicit judgments about how people in similar situations should act. The parent's treatment decisions reflect beliefs about the value of different kinds of medical intervention, the importance of quality versus quantity of life, the appropriate balance between hope and acceptance. The student's choice of major reflects beliefs about what kinds of work have value, what kinds of skills deserve development, what kind of problems deserve attention. This responsibility for implicit universal judgment can feel overwhelming, but Sartre argued that attempting to avoid it leads to bad faith, the denial of either our freedom or our responsibility. We might pretend that external authorities make our choices for us, denying our freedom, or that our choices don't really matter beyond their immediate practical consequences, denying our responsibility. Bad faith provides temporary psychological relief from anguish, but it does so at the cost of authenticity and ultimately of meaning. When we deny our freedom, we become less than fully human. When we deny our responsibility, we disconnect our actions from our values and purposes. The existentialist approach to anxiety, absurdity, and anguish doesn't offer techniques for eliminating these experiences, but rather ways of understanding them that make them more bearable and even valuable. These difficult emotions become signals that we are taking our existence seriously, engaging authentically with our circumstances, and refusing easy consolations that would diminish our humanity. This approach requires developing what we might call existential courage, the willingness to live with uncertainty, to act without guarantees, to take responsibility without complete control. This courage isn't the absence of fear or anxiety, but the decision to act meaningfully despite their presence. Existential courage also involves accepting what Martin Heidegger called thrownness, The recognition that we find ourselves in circumstances we didn't choose, but must navigate as best we can. We're thrown into particular families, cultures, historical moments, and biological conditions. We can't choose our starting points, but we must choose how to respond to them. The acceptance of thrownness helps distinguish productive anxiety from neurotic worry. Productive anxiety responds to real uncertainties that require our attention and choice. Neurotic worry focuses on uncertainties beyond our control or on imaginary problems that distract us from real choices we need to make. Someone experiencing productive anxiety about career decisions might feel uncomfortable, but will use that discomfort to motivate serious reflection about their values, goals, and options. Someone experiencing neurotic worry might become paralyzed by imagining catastrophic outcomes beyond their control or by second-guessing decisions that have already been made and can't be changed. The embrace of anxiety and absurdity also involves recognizing their social and political dimensions. Individual anxiety and absurdity often reflect larger cultural and historical circumstances that affect entire communities and generations. The anxiety that young adults experience about their futures may reflect genuine uncertainties about economic opportunities, environmental sustainability, and social stability. Similarly, the sense of absurdity that many people experience may reflect actual contradictions and irrationalities in social systems that promise fairness but deliver inequality, that claim to value human welfare but prioritize economic efficiency, that proclaim democratic ideals but concentrate power among elites. Existentialism doesn't suggest that these larger problems are merely personal issues to be resolved through individual attitude changes. Instead, it suggests that authentic responses to anxiety and absurdity often require both personal and social engagement, working to change problematic conditions while also accepting the uncertainties that will remain regardless of how much progress we make. This dual approach helps avoid both cynical withdrawal from social engagement and naive optimism about the possibility of eliminating all problems through political action. We can work seriously for social justice, environmental sustainability, and human welfare, while also accepting that these efforts will never create perfect conditions or eliminate all sources of anxiety and absurdity. The embrace of anxiety and absurdity ultimately leads to what Camus called lucid indifference, to ultimate outcomes combined with passionate engagement with immediate possibilities. We can care deeply about our projects and relationships while also recognizing their temporary and uncertain nature. We can work seriously for causes we believe in while also accepting that our efforts may fail or have consequences we didn't intend. This combination of engagement and detachment, passion and acceptance, creates a distinctive existentialist stance toward life that acknowledges both its difficulties and its possibilities. We don't pretend that existence is easy or that meaning is guaranteed, but we also don't conclude that difficulty makes existence meaningless or that uncertainty makes choice impossible. Instead, we recognize that anxiety and absurdity are not obstacles to meaningful living, but integral aspects of what it means to be conscious, choosing, responsible beings in a complex and uncertain world. They remind us that we are free, that our choices matter, and that we must create our own significance rather than discovering it ready-made. In embracing these difficult aspects of human existence, we don't become pessimistic or despairing. Instead, we become more realistic about the conditions under which meaning must be created and more appreciative of the meaning we do manage to create despite these conditions. The boulder may roll back down the mountain, but the act of pushing can still express everything valuable about human dignity, persistence, and refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond our control. Part 6. Responsibility and Freedom. The relationship between freedom and responsibility forms the philosophical heart of existentialism and provides a foundation for understanding how meaning emerges from human existence. But existentialist responsibility differs fundamentally from traditional notions of moral obligation. Instead of following predetermined rules, divine commands, or social expectations, existentialist responsibility involves taking full ownership of our choices and their consequences, while recognizing that these choices inevitably affect others and contribute to the ongoing human experiment in creating meaningful existence. This understanding of responsibility begins with Jean-Paul Sartre's radical claim that we are condemned to be free. This isn't a celebration of liberation, but a recognition of an inescapable burden. We cannot avoid choosing, even when we try to avoid choice. The decision not to choose is itself a choice. The decision to let others choose for us is itself a choice. The decision to follow tradition, authority, or custom is itself a choice. We are responsible not only for our explicit decisions, but also for our implicit ones. Not only for our actions, but also for our inactions. This total responsibility can feel overwhelming because it extends far beyond what traditional morality requires. In conventional ethical systems, we're typically responsible for following established rules, fulfilling assigned roles, and avoiding harm to others. We can discharge our obligations by conforming to external standards, and we can blame those standards if conformity leads to unsatisfactory results. Existentialist responsibility goes much deeper. We are responsible not only for following rules, but for choosing which rules to follow. We are responsible not only for fulfilling roles, but for choosing which roles to embrace and how to interpret them. We are responsible not only for avoiding harm, but for deciding what constitutes harm and what kind of harm are worth risking for what kinds of benefits. This expanded notion of responsibility emerges from the existentialist insight that human beings are fundamentally different from other entities in the world. A rock doesn't choose to fall when dropped. It follows physical laws. A plant doesn't choose to grow towards sunlight. It follows biological programming. But human beings can reflect on their circumstances, imagine alternatives, and choose among options based on values and purposes they themselves create. This capacity for reflective choice makes us responsible in ways that rocks and plants cannot be responsible. But it also makes us responsible in ways that exceed traditional human moral frameworks, which were developed to govern behavior within communities that share basic assumptions about values, purposes, and proper conduct. Sartre illustrated this expanded responsibility through his famous example of a young man during World War II who faced a choice between joining the French resistance or staying home to care for his mother. Traditional moral frameworks might provide conflicting guidance. Duty to country suggests joining the resistance. Duty to family suggests staying home. Utilitarian calculation might point either direction depending on how one weighs different consequences. Sartre's point wasn't that such choices are impossible to make, but that they can't be made by appealing to external authorities, because the choice of which authority to consult is itself a choice that expresses our values and priorities. The young man must decide not only what to do, but what kind of person to become, what kind of values to embody, what kind of responsibilities to prioritize. Whatever he chooses, he bears full responsibility for his choice and its consequences. If he joins a resistance and his mother suffers from his absence, he cannot blame the resistance cause for requiring his sacrifice. If he stays home and the resistance fails partly due to his absence, he cannot blame family duty for preventing his participation. His choice expresses his judgment about what matters most, and he must own that judgment completely. This total responsibility extends beyond individual consequences to what Sartre called our responsibility for choosing for all humanity. When we make significant choices, we implicitly suggest how people in similar circumstances should act. Our choices become implicit recommendations about what kinds of lives are worth living, what kinds of values are worth embracing, what kinds of purposes are worth pursuing. This doesn't mean that our individual choices create universal obligations that everyone must follow. It means that our choices contribute to the ongoing human conversation about what constitutes authentic, meaningful existence. When someone chooses to prioritize artistic creation over financial security, they're not insisting that everyone should make the same choice, but they're suggesting that artistic values deserve respect and consideration in human affairs. This social dimension of responsibility becomes particularly important when we consider how individual choices aggregate into cultural and political realities. The choices we make about consumption, career, relationships, and civic engagement don't just affect our individual lives. They contribute to larger patterns that shape the options available to others. Someone who chooses to consume ethically produced goods despite their higher cost is taking responsibility not only for their own impact on labor and environmental conditions, but also for supporting economic systems that prioritize ethical considerations. Their individual choice may have minimal direct impact, but it joins with similar choices by others to create market pressures that can influence corporate behavior and policy development. Similarly, someone who chooses to engage in local political processes despite the frustrations and limitations of democratic institutions is taking responsibility not only for their own civic participation, but also for maintaining, and improving the democratic culture that future generations will inherit. This aggregated dimension of responsibility helps explain why existentialism isn't as individualistic as it might initially appear. While it emphasizes individual choice and authenticity, it also recognizes that individuals exist within social contexts that both constrain and enable their choices. We are responsible not only for our individual authenticity, but also for contributing to social conditions that support or undermine others' opportunities for authentic choice. Simone de Beauvoir developed this insight through her analysis of how oppression limits authentic choice. When social systems deny certain groups access to education, economic opportunity, political participation, or cultural expression, they prevent those groups from exercising the full range of human freedom and responsibility. In such circumstances, supporting liberation movements becomes a way of taking responsibility for creating conditions in which all people can engage authentically with their existence. De Beauvoir argued that we cannot be fully free while others remain oppressed, because freedom is not a possession that individuals can hoard, but condition that emerges through relationships among equals. When we participate in or benefit from systems that deny others freedom, we diminish our own authenticity by acting inconsistently with our nature as free, choosing, responsible beings. This creates what we might call solidarity responsibility, the recognition that our individual freedom and authenticity depend partly on supporting social conditions that enable others to exercise their freedom and authenticity. This doesn't require sacrificing our individual projects for collective causes, but it does require considering how our individual choices affect the broader human community. The existentialist understanding of responsibility also helps clarify the relationship between freedom and determinism that has long puzzled philosophers and scientists. Existentialism doesn't deny that human behavior is influenced by genetic inheritance, psychological conditioning, social pressures, and historical circumstances. But it insists that these influences never completely determine our choices, because we retain the capacity to reflect on our influences and choose how to respond to them. Viktor Frankl demonstrated this principle under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Even in Nazi concentration camps, where external freedom was almost completely eliminated, individuals retained what Frankl called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose their attitude toward their situation. Some prisoners became brutal and selfish. Others maintained compassion and dignity. The external circumstances were similar, but individuals responded differently based on choices they made about how to interpret and respond to their situation. This doesn't minimize the reality or impact of external constraints. Frankl didn't suggest that concentration camp prisoners were free in any ordinary sense, or that their circumstances didn't profoundly limit their options. But he observed that even under the most constraining circumstances, some element of choice remained, and that element made the difference between maintaining or losing one's humanity. The same principle applies to less extreme, but still challenging circumstances that most people face. Someone born into poverty doesn't choose that situation, but they can choose how to respond to it, whether to accept it as inevitable, work to change their individual circumstances, fight for systemic change, or find meaning despite economic constraints. Someone facing serious illness doesn't choose their diagnosis, but they can choose how to approach treatment, how to relate to family and friends, how to make use of whatever time remains available. The recognition of residual freedom, even under constraint, leads to what existentialists call situated freedom, the understanding that we are always free within particular circumstances, rather than free in some abstract, unlimited sense. Our freedom always operates within constraints imposed by our biology, psychology, society, and history. But within those constraints, meaningful choice remains possible. This situated understanding of freedom helps avoid both naive optimism about human possibilities and cynical determinism about human limitations. We don't pretend that people can overcome all obstacles through willpower alone, but we also don't conclude that obstacles eliminate all possibility of meaningful choice and authentic living. The practical implications of existentialist responsibility extend to how we understand success and failure, guilt and pride, regret and satisfaction. If we are fully responsible for our choices, then we cannot blame external circumstances for our failures or credit external circumstances for our successes. This might seem harsh, but it's also empowering, because it means that meaningful achievement is always possible regardless of circumstances. Someone who creates a meaningful life despite significant obstacles can take genuine pride in that achievement because it reflects their choices rather than their advantages. Someone who fails to create meaning despite significant advantages cannot blame external circumstances because their failure reflects their choices rather than their disadvantages. This doesn't mean that circumstances don't matter or that all people face equal opportunities. It means that within whatever circumstances we face, we retain responsibility for choosing how to respond. And that responsibility cannot be delegated to others or avoided through appeals to external authorities. The acceptance of total responsibility also affects how we relate to our own past choices and their consequences. Instead of spending energy on regret about decisions we cannot change, existentialist responsibility encourages us to focus on how we choose to respond to the consequences of past decisions. Instead of seeking someone to blame for current difficulties, it encourages us to identify whatever choices remain available for addressing those difficulties. This forward-looking orientation doesn't eliminate reflection on past mistakes or learning from experience, but it focuses that reflection on improving future choices rather than on assigning blame for past problems. We take responsibility for our past not by feeling guilty about it, but by learning from it and using that learning to make better choices going forward. The integration of freedom and responsibility also illuminates why existentialism places such emphasis on authenticity and self-creation. If we are truly responsible for our choices, then those choices must genuinely reflect our own values and judgments rather than conformity to external expectations. Inauthentic choices, those made primarily to please others, fit in with social norms, or avoid personal anxiety, cannot be owned completely because they don't fully express our agency. This creates a demanding standard for authentic living. We must take responsibility not only for our explicit choices, but also for developing the values and purposes that guide those choices. We must choose not only what to do, but who to become, not only how to act, but how to judge our actions, not only what goals to pursue, but what makes those goals worthy of pursuit. The burden of total responsibility might seem unbearable, and indeed it can generate significant anxiety and anguish. But existentialism argues that this burden is inseparable from human dignity. What makes us uniquely valuable as beings is precisely our capacity to take responsibility for creating meaning, values, and purposes rather than simply following predetermined patterns. The alternative to accepting this responsibility is not greater happiness or peace, but a diminished form of existence that fails to actualize our distinctive capacities as conscious, choosing, creative beings. We can avoid the anxiety of responsibility, but only by becoming less than fully human. In embracing both freedom and responsibility, we accept what Sartre called the fundamental project of human existence, the ongoing task of creating ourselves and our world through the choices we make individually and collectively. This project has no predetermined endpoint, no guaranteed success, no external validation. But it offers something that predetermined purposes cannot: the dignity of genuine agency and the satisfaction of authentic self-creation. The meaning we create through the exercise of freedom and responsibility may be temporary, uncertain, and limited, but it is genuinely our own. And in a universe without predetermined purposes, that ownership of our own meaning-making may be the most profound achievement possible. Most meaningful relationships naturally oscillate between moments of I-thou encounter and periods of I-it interaction, and this rhythm is both necessary and healthy. The key is ensuring that important relationships include sufficient I-thou encounters to maintain recognition of each other's full humanity and to prevent relationships from becoming purely instrumental. Simone de Beauvoir expanded existentialist thinking about relationships by examining how social inequalities affect the possibility of authentic encounter with others. When people relate from positions of significant inequality, whether economic, political, racial, gender-based, or cultural, genuine I-thou relationships become difficult because the power differential distorts communication and limits authentic self-expression on both sides. Someone in a position of social disadvantage might feel pressure to present themselves in ways that make more privileged individuals comfortable, suppressing aspects of their experience or perspective that might challenge or disturb. Someone in a position of privilege might remain unconsciously unaware of how their advantages affect others' behavior around them, mistaking carefully managed interactions for genuine connection. These dynamics can prevent both parties from relating authentically, even when both have good intentions and desire meaningful connection. De Beauvoir's analysis suggests that working for social equality becomes important not only for reasons of justice, but also for creating conditions that support authentic relationships. When people can relate from positions of approximate equality, in resources, opportunities, and social recognition, they can more easily encounter each other as fellow subjects rather than as representatives of different social categories or as potential threats to their security. This doesn't mean that all relationships must be perfectly equal in every dimension, or that differences in experience, knowledge, or capability prevent authentic connection. It means that relationships function best when differences don't translate into fundamental inequalities of power, respect, or opportunity for self-expression. A teacher and student can have an authentic relationship despite differences in knowledge and authority if both recognize each other's dignity and the student has genuine opportunities to express their own thoughts and questions. The existentialist understanding of relationships also illuminates the constructive role that conflict and disagreement can play in human connection. Many contemporary approaches to relationships emphasize harmony, agreement, and mutual support as primary indicators of healthy connection. While these elements are important, existentialism suggests that authentic relationships also require capacity to disagree meaningfully, to challenge each other's assumptions, and to maintain individual integrity even when it creates tension. Someone who agrees with others primarily to maintain surface harmony rather than because they genuinely share those perspectives is not relating authentically. They are presenting a false self designed to avoid conflict rather than engaging honestly with their own values and with others' ideas. Similarly, someone who consistently avoids expressing views that might upset others is preventing genuine encounter by hiding aspects of themselves that others might need to see in order to understand who they really are. Authentic relationships require what we might call loving disagreement, the capacity to challenge others' views while maintaining fundamental respect for their right to hold those views, and the willingness to be challenged by others while maintaining confidence in one's own perspective. This kind of disagreement serves relationship rather than threatening it, because it allows both parties to encounter each other more completely and to grow through exposure to different viewpoints. This capacity for loving disagreement becomes particularly crucial in intimate relationships, where partners must navigate inevitable differences in values, preferences, life goals, and ways of understanding the world. Couples who suppress disagreement to maintain surface harmony often discover that their relationship gradually becomes shallow because they are relating to idealized versions of each other rather than to each other's full complexity, including aspects that might be challenging or uncomfortable. By contrast, couples who can disagree authentically while maintaining fundamental care and respect often develop deeper intimacy because they know they are accepted for who they actually are rather than for whom they pretend to be. Their relationship becomes a space where both can continue to grow, change, and explore new aspects of themselves rather than a constraint that requires them to remain static to avoid disruption. The existentialist approach to relationships also addresses a complex relationship between commitment and freedom in human connection. Traditional perspectives often frame commitment as a constraint on freedom. We sacrifice certain possibilities and limit our options in order to maintain loyalty to particular people. Existentialism suggests a more nuanced understanding. Authentic commitment can actually enhance freedom by creating secure contexts within which we can explore aspects of ourselves that require trust, vulnerability, and sustained support. Someone in a committed romantic relationship isn't simply constrained by that commitment, but is also enabled by it to explore forms of intimacy, emotional vulnerability, and mutual care that aren't possible in casual relationships. Parents aren't merely limited by their responsibilities to their children, but are also provided opportunities to develop forms of patience, selfless concern, and unconditional love that contribute to their own human flourishing. However, existentialist commitment differs from traditional commitment because it must be continuously chosen rather than simply maintained through habit, social pressure, or past promises. Authentic commitment requires ongoing reflection about whether the relationship continues to serve both parties' development toward greater authenticity, and whether forms of connection remain genuine rather than merely conventional. This perspective doesn't make authentic relationships unstable or constantly questioned. Rather, it keeps them vital through continuous choice rather than allowing them to become stagnant through unexamined routine. Partners in authentic relationships continue to choose each other not primarily because they made promises in the past, but because they continue to find genuine value in their connection and mutual growth. Ultimately, the existentialist understanding of relationships reveals that our encounters with others are neither obstacles to authentic existence nor sources of ready-made meaning. Instead, they provide the essential context within which we discover aspects of ourselves that remain invisible in isolation, challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding, and create opportunities to practice the values we choose to embrace. Through our relationships, whether intimate or casual, harmonious or challenging, temporary or enduring, we both express our authentic selves and continue to discover who we are becoming. Part 7. Relationships and the Other. One of the most persistent misconceptions about existentialism is that it represents a purely individualistic philosophy concerned solely with personal authenticity and self-creation at the expense of meaningful human connection. This misunderstanding stems from existentialism's emphasis on individual responsibility, freedom, and authentic choice, leading critics to characterize it as a philosophy of isolation and selfishness. However, this interpretation fundamentally misses one of existentialism's most profound insights. Our encounters with others are not obstacles to authentic existence, but essential components of it. The other, as existentialist philosophers call the people we encounter throughout our lives, plays a crucial role in challenging our assumptions, enriching our self-understanding, and providing the context within which we create meaningful existence. The relationship with the other begins at the most fundamental level of self-awareness itself. Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of what he called the look of the other reveals how our very sense of ourselves as individuals emerges through our encounters with other conscious beings. When we exist alone, absorbed in our own thoughts and experiences, we exist primarily as what Sartre called being for itself, pure consciousness observing and interpreting the world around us. We are the subject of our experience, the center of our own reality, aware of our freedom and our capacity to choose. But the moment another person enters our awareness, this comfortable subjectivity becomes complicated. Imagine walking through a park, lost in contemplation, when you suddenly notice someone watching you. In that instant, you become aware of yourself not just as the observer, but as the observed. You experience what Sartre called objectification, the unsettling realization that you exist not only as a subject, but also as an object in someone else's consciousness. You wonder what they see when they look at you. Are you walking too slowly? Do your clothes look appropriate? Does your facial expression convey confidence or anxiety? What story are they creating about who you are based on this momentary encounter? This dual awareness, existing simultaneously as subject and object, initially creates what Sartre described as a profound discomfort. We cannot directly access how others perceive us, cannot control the interpretations they make of our actions and appearance, cannot ensure that their understanding of us aligns with our understanding of ourselves. The gap between how we experience ourselves and how others might interpret us reveals the limits of our self-knowledge and the complexity of human existence in a social world. Yet, this discomfort serves an essential function in authentic human development. Someone who never considers how they appear to others, who remains trapped in pure subjectivity, might develop a distorted or unrealistic understanding of their impact on the world. They might overestimate their capabilities, remain unaware of harmful behaviors, or fail to develop empathy for others' experiences. The other's gaze forces us to recognize perspectives beyond our own and to develop more nuanced self-awareness. However, Sartre also warned against the opposite extreme, becoming so preoccupied with others' perceptions that we lose touch with our own authentic values and choices. When we define ourselves primarily through others' eyes, constantly adjusting our behavior to manage their impressions, we risk what he called bad faith, denying our own freedom by pretending that others' opinions determine who we must be. Someone who chooses their career, lifestyle, or values primarily based on what will impress others is fleeing from the anxiety of authentic choice by allowing external validation to substitute for genuine self-reflection. The challenge, then, is to remain open to others' perspectives without becoming enslaved by them. Authentic existence requires integrating others' viewpoints into our self-understanding while maintaining the courage to act according to our own deepest convictions, even when those actions might disappoint or confuse others. Martin Buber approached the relationship with the other through his influential distinction between what he called I thou and I it relationships. In I it relationships, we treat others as objects to be understood, categorized, used, or manipulated for our own purposes. We might relate to a store clerk merely as a function, someone who processes our transaction efficiently. We might see a romantic partner primarily as a source of emotional satisfaction or social status. We might view colleagues mainly as resources for advancing our career goals or as obstacles to overcome. I-it relationships aren't necessarily harmful or morally wrong. Much of daily life requires treating others in functional terms to accomplish practical tasks and navigate social institutions. We cannot relate to every person we encounter with the same depth of personal engagement without becoming overwhelmed and ineffective. The problem arises when I-it becomes our dominant or exclusive mode of relating to others, when we consistently reduce people to their utility for our purposes and lose sight of their full humanity. I-thou relationships, by contrast, involve encountering others as complete subjects with their own consciousness, freedom, struggles, and purposes. In genuine I-thou encounters, we recognize that others are not simply means to our ends, but ends in themselves, beings whose existence has inherent value independent of their usefulness to us. These relationships require what Buber called genuine meeting, moments when the ordinary social roles and categories temporarily dissolve and we see each other more directly and completely. Such encounters often occur during times of vulnerability, crisis, or deep sharing when people's defenses drop and their common humanity becomes visible. A conversation with someone who is grieving might shift from I-it concern, what can I do to help you feel better? To I-thou recognition, I see your pain and recognize it as connected to the fundamental vulnerability we all share. A moment of genuine laughter or shared wonder might create temporary connection that transcends usual social boundaries and creates mutual recognition of each other's full personhood. Buber argued that I-thou encounters are essential for authentic human development because they remind us that we exist in a world populated by other conscious, choosing beings rather than merely by objects that serve our purposes. These encounters also provide forms of recognition and confirmation that cannot be achieved through I-it relationships. When someone truly sees and accepts us in our full complexity, including aspects we might prefer to hide, we experience a validation of our existence that strengthens our capacity for authentic self-expression. However, I-thou relationships cannot be maintained constantly. They require significant emotional and psychological energy and would quickly become overwhelming if sustained continuously. Part 8. Death and Finitude. Death occupies a unique position in existentialist philosophy, not as a morbid obsession or source of paralyzing fear, but as perhaps the most crucial factor in understanding what it means to live an authentic, meaningful existence. While many philosophical and religious traditions have attempted to minimize death's significance by promising eternal life or suggesting that death is merely an illusion, existentialism confronts mortality directly and argues that our finite nature is not a flaw in the human condition, but its most defining characteristic. The fact that life ends, that our time is limited, that every moment brings us closer to our final breath. These realities don't diminish life's meaning, but rather create the very conditions that make meaning possible and urgent. Martin Heidegger, whose work profoundly influenced existentialist thought, introduced the concept of being toward death as a fundamental aspect of authentic human existence. For Heidegger, most people spend their lives in what he called everydayness, a mode of existence where we become absorbed in routine activities, social roles, and cultural expectations while avoiding confrontation with life's fundamental questions. We busy ourselves with work, entertainment, relationships, and various projects, all while maintaining an unconscious assumption that we have unlimited time to figure things out, to become who we're meant to be, to address what truly matters. This avoidance of mortality creates what Heidegger called inauthentic existence, a way of living that treats death as something that happened to other people, something distant and abstract rather than the most certain fact about our own future. We might intellectually acknowledge that everyone dies, but we live as though we personally are exceptions to this rule, as though death is a problem that future technology might solve or a distant event that doesn't affect our present decisions. Being toward death, by contrast, involves maintaining conscious awareness of our mortality as we navigate daily life. This doesn't mean becoming preoccupied with death or living in constant fear of dying. Instead, it means allowing the reality of finitude to inform our choices, priorities, and understanding of what matters. When we fully acknowledge that our time is limited, that every opportunity not taken represents a genuine loss, that relationships neglected cannot be indefinitely postponed, our entire approach to existence shifts. Consider how differently you might approach a conversation with a loved one if you truly believed it could be your last. The trivial complaints, petty arguments, and misconnections that characterize many relationships suddenly seem less important than expressing genuine care, sharing authentic thoughts, and creating meaningful connection. This shift doesn't require dramatic gestures or constant emotional intensity. It simply involves bringing fuller presence and intentionality to moments that we might otherwise treat as routine or expendable. The awareness of mortality also serves as what we might call an authenticity filter that helps distinguish between what genuinely matters to us and what merely distracts us from confronting life's essential questions. When faced with a significant decision, whether to change careers, end or deepen a relationship, pursue a creative project, or make a major life transition, the question, what would I choose if I knew my time was limited, often cuts through social expectations, cultural pressures, and fear-based reasoning to reveal our deeper values and desires. This doesn't mean that mortality awareness leads to reckless or impulsive behavior. Someone who quits their job on a whim because life is short may be fleeing from responsibility rather than embracing authentic choice. True being toward death involves carefully considering how we want to use our finite time and energy, recognizing that every choice involves opportunity costs, and that authentic living requires accepting these limitations rather than pretending they don't exist. Jean-Paul Sartre approached mortality from a different angle, emphasizing how death gives weight and urgency to our freedom. If we had infinite time, Sartre argued, we could postpone difficult decisions indefinitely. We could try every possible career, explore every potential relationship, experiment with every lifestyle without consequence. The pressure to choose would disappear because we could always change our minds without losing anything significant. But mortality creates what Sartre called situated freedom. Freedom that must be exercised within specific constraints. We cannot be everything or experience everything. So we must choose what kind of person to become, what values to prioritize, what relationships to cultivate. These choices carry weight precisely because our time is limited and each path chosen means others must be abandoned. This limitation might initially seem like a restriction on human potential, but Sartre argued that it actually makes authentic choice possible. Without constraints, decisions become arbitrary rather than meaningful. Someone choosing a career from infinite options with unlimited time to change their mind is not making a significant choice, but merely expressing a temporary preference. Someone choosing a career while aware that this decision will shape years of their life and limit other possibilities is making a choice that reflects their deepest values and commitments. The existentialist understanding of mortality also illuminates the relationship between death and meaning. Many people assume that life's meaning must be eternal to be genuine, that if our existence ends completely at death, then nothing we do ultimately matters. Existentialism suggests the opposite. It is precisely because our time is limited that our choices become precious and significant. Consider the difference between a painting created by an immortal being with unlimited time and resources versus one created by a human artist aware of their mortality. The immortal's work, no matter how technically perfect, carries less existential weight because it emerges from a context of unlimited possibility. The mortal artist's work gains meaning partly through the knowledge that their creative time is finite, that this particular expression represents a unique moment in a life that will end, that the vision they're trying to capture might never again find expression if they don't succeed now. Similarly, acts of love, courage, creativity, and compassion gain their significance partly through the knowledge that they emerge from finite beings who could have chosen differently and whose opportunity to act will not last forever. A mother's care for a child, a friend's loyalty during difficult times, an artist's dedication to their craft, a citizen's commitment to justice. These actions resonate with meaning partly because we know they arise from creatures whose time is precious and limited. Albert Camus extended this analysis through his exploration of what he called the absurd, the conflict between our desire for eternal meaning and the apparent fact that the universe offers no such guarantees. Humans naturally seek permanence, ultimate purpose, and cosmic significance, but we exist in a universe that appears indifferent to these desires. Death serves as the ultimate reminder of this absurdity. Despite our projects, relationships, and achievements, we all face the same final ending. Camus famously used the myth of Sisyphus to illustrate the human condition. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, knowing that each time he reached the summit, the boulder would roll back down, requiring him to begin again. This seems like the perfect metaphor for human futility. We build careers that end in retirement and death, create relationships that are severed by mortality, pursue knowledge that dies with us, construct civilizations that eventually crumble. But Camus argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because Sisyphus has accepted his situation and found ways to create meaning within it rather than waiting for external sources to provide meaning for him. The struggle itself becomes meaningful. The dignity of persisting despite absurdity, the beauty found in moment of connection and achievement, even though they are temporary, the courage to continue creating and loving despite mortality. These responses to the human condition generate their own significance. This perspective transforms our relationship with mortality from denial or despair, what Camus called lucid indifference. We need not pretend that death doesn't exist or rage against its inevitability. Instead, we can acknowledge mortality as a fundamental condition of human existence while choosing how to respond to that condition. We become the authors of our own significance within the constraints that define us. Viktor Frankl, whose existentialist insights emerged from his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, demonstrated how awareness of mortality can deepen rather than diminish life's meaning. Surrounded by death and facing the constant possibility of his own execution, Frankl observed that those prisoners who maintained meaning and dignity were often those who had accepted their mortality while choosing how to respond to their circumstances. Frankl noticed that prisoners who clung desperately to the illusion that they would surely survive often broke down when that hope was challenged. Those who accepted the real possibility of death while choosing to maintain their values, care for others, and find meaning in their present experience often displayed remarkable resilience and humanity even in the most dehumanizing conditions. This doesn't mean that accepting mortality makes death less tragic or loss less painful. The death of loved ones, the cutting short of promising lives, the ending of relationships and projects that brought joy and meaning, these experiences remain genuinely heartbreaking for those who must continue living. But acknowledging mortality as a universal human condition can help us approach these losses with greater wisdom, compassion, and appreciation for what we have while we have it. The existentialist approach to mortality also addresses the role of legacy and continuity in human meaning-making. While existentialism rejects the idea that life's meaning depends on eternal duration, it doesn't dismiss the importance of how our choices and actions affect others and continue beyond our individual deaths. The values we model, the relationships we nurture, the creative works we produce, the positive changes we help bring about, these contributions become part of the ongoing human story even after our personal chapter ends. But existentialism emphasizes that these contributions gain their meaning primarily through our present commitment to them rather than through their future duration. Someone who acts ethically only to ensure a positive legacy is still seeking external validation for their choices. Someone who acts ethically because they believe ethical action reflects who they choose to be creates meaning through the choice itself, regardless of how long its effects might last. The awareness of mortality also deepens our capacity for gratitude and presence. When we truly understand that every experience, every conversation, sunset, meal, laugh, moment of beauty or connection represents something that will not last forever, we can approach these experiences with greater attention and appreciation. This doesn't require constant intensity or artificial gratitude, but rather a gentle awareness that the present moment is both precious and temporary. Many people report that brushes with their own mortality, serious illness, accidents, or the death of loved ones create profound shifts in their priorities and appreciation for life. Suddenly, the routine complaints and worries that previously consumed their attention seem less important than expressing love, pursuing meaningful work, or simply being fully present to their experience. Existentialism suggests that we need not wait for crisis to access this perspective. We can cultivate being toward death as a regular practice that informs our choices and deepens our engagement with life. Ultimately, The existentialist understanding of death and finitude reveals mortality not as life's enemy, but as an essential companion. Death gives urgency to our choices, weight to our commitments, and preciousness to our experiences. It creates the conditions within which authenticity becomes both possible and necessary. Rather than seeking to escape or deny our mortality, existentialism invites us to embrace finitude as a foundation for creating genuine meaning in the brief, extraordinary opportunity we call human life. Part 9. Practical Applications. Understanding existentialist philosophy intellectually is one thing. Integrating its insights into daily life is another challenge entirely. The gap between philosophical understanding and practical application can feel overwhelming when faced with the concrete decisions, relationships, and responsibilities that structure our everyday existence. How do we translate concepts like authenticity, freedom, responsibility, and being toward death into actionable approaches for navigating careers, relationships, parenting, creativity, and the countless smaller choices that collectively shape our lives? The practical application of existentialist insights requires developing new habits of self-reflection, decision-making, and engagement with others that honor both our radical freedom and our profound responsibility. The foundation of practical existentialism begins with taking your choices seriously, recognizing that even seemingly minor decisions reflect and shape your values, your character, and the kind of world you're helping to create. This doesn't mean agonizing over every choice or becoming paralyzed by the weight of responsibility, but rather developing what we might call choice consciousness, a heightened awareness of the fact that you are constantly choosing and that these choices matter. Consider something as routine as how you respond to a service worker who makes a mistake with your order. You might respond with irritation and demands, with patient understanding, with indifference, or with humor. Each response reflects an implicit choice about what kind of interactions you want to create, what treatment you believe people deserve when they're imperfect, and what role you want to play in others' daily experiences. An existentialist approach doesn't dictate which response is correct, but emphasizes that each response represents a choice about the kind of person you're becoming and the kind of world you're helping to create. Developing choice consciousness often begins with pausing before significant decisions to ask yourself deeper questions. Why am I considering this option? What values does this choice reflect? Am I choosing based on my authentic convictions or responding to external pressures? What kind of person will this choice help me become? How might this decision affect others? These questions don't necessarily change the choices you make, but they help ensure that your choices emerge from genuine reflection rather than habit, fear, or social conditioning. Career decisions provide particularly rich opportunities for applying existentialist principles. Many people choose careers based on external factors: salary potential, social status, family expectations, or job security, while giving less consideration to whether their work aligns with their deeper values and allows for authentic self-expression. An existentialist approach doesn't dismiss practical considerations like financial stability, but emphasizes the importance of finding work that enables you to express your authentic commitments while contributing meaningfully to the world. This might involve asking yourself, does my work allow me to use my genuine talents and interests? Do the values embedded in my profession and workplace align with my personal convictions? Am I contributing to outcomes I actually care about? Do I have opportunities for growth, creativity, and meaningful challenge? Can I maintain my integrity within this professional context? These questions become particularly important during times of career transition or when facing ethical conflict at work. Someone working in a profession that conflicts with their values faces the existentialist challenge of choosing between security and authenticity. A lawyer who discovers they care more about social justice than corporate profits. A teacher working in a system they believe harms students. A marketing professional asked to promote products they consider harmful. These situations require honest confrontation with the tension between external pressures and authentic values. Existentialism doesn't prescribe specific solutions, but emphasizes that whatever choice you make becomes part of who you are and reflects what you value most deeply. Relationships offer another crucial arena for practical existentialist application. Rather than approaching relationships as sources of happiness or security that should meet predetermined expectations, existentialism suggests viewing relationships as opportunities for mutual growth, authentic expression, and meaningful connection. This shifts focus from what can this relationship do for me to how can we support each other's authentic development while creating genuine connection? In romantic relationships, this might mean choosing partners based on your capacity for mutual growth rather than just comfort or attraction. It involves communicating authentically even when it creates temporary tension, supporting your partner's individual development even when it challenges a relationship, and taking responsibility for your contribution to relationship dynamics rather than focusing primarily on your partner's shortcomings. The existentialist approach to conflict in relationships emphasizes honest communication while respecting both parties' freedom to disagree. Instead of avoiding conflict to maintain harmony or using conflict to control others, existentialist relationships treat disagreement as opportunities for deeper understanding and authentic expression. This requires developing skills in what we might call authentic confrontation, the ability to express concerns, needs, and boundaries clearly while remaining open to your partner's perspective and committed to mutual respect. Parenting from an existentialist perspective involves balancing necessary guidance and protection with respect for children's developing autonomy and authentic self-expression. This means setting appropriate boundaries while avoiding the temptation to live vicariously through children's achievements or to pressure them into fulfilling parents' unfulfilled dreams. Existentialist parents try to model authenticity, responsibility, and courage while creating environments where children can explore their own values and make age-appropriate choices. This approach recognizes that children are not blank slates to be programmed, but emerging individuals with their own temperaments, interests, and potential for authentic development. The parent's role becomes supporting this development while teaching necessary skills, values, and social awareness. This might involve allowing children to experience natural consequences of their choices, encouraging them to think critically about social pressures and expectations, and helping them develop their own moral reasoning rather than simply following rules. Financial decisions also provide opportunities for existentialist practice. Rather than viewing money purely as a means to security or status, existentialism encourages examining how your financial choices reflect your values and contribute to the kind of world you want to create. This might involve questioning consumer habits that conflict with your environmental values, considering how your spending supports or opposes social justice, or examining whether your financial goals align with your deeper priorities. Someone pursuing financial success primarily for social status might discover through existentialist reflection that they actually value creative expression, meaningful relationships, or social contribution more than wealth accumulation. This doesn't mean rejecting financial responsibility, but rather ensuring that financial decisions serve authentic values rather than external expectations or unconscious fears. The practical application of existentialism also involves developing what we might call uncertainty tolerance, the capacity to act decisively while acknowledging that you cannot control all outcomes or guarantee that your choices will lead to desired results. This requires distinguishing between what you can control, your choices, your responses, your effort, and what you cannot control, other people's reactions, external circumstances, or long-term outcomes. Anxiety often arises from trying to control uncontrollable factors or from avoiding necessary choices, because we cannot guarantee positive outcomes. Existentialist practice involves accepting responsibility for what you can control while releasing attachment to results beyond your influence. This creates what we might call engaged attachment, full commitment to authentic action combined with acceptance of whatever consequences may arise. This principle applies particularly to creative endeavors, where the gap between intention and outcome is often significant. A writer cannot control whether their book finds an audience, but they can control their commitment to honest expression and skillful craft. An entrepreneur cannot guarantee their business will succeed, but they can ensure their venture reflects their authentic values and serves genuine needs. This focus on controllable factors often paradoxically leads to better outcomes because it eliminates the anxiety and second-guessing that interfere with effective action. Developing emotional intelligence becomes crucial for existentialist practice because authentic choices require honest self-awareness, including awareness of emotional patterns that might compromise your judgment. This involves learning to distinguish between emotions that provide valuable information about your values and circumstances versus emotions that arise from unexamined fears, social conditioning, or past trauma. For example, anxiety about making a major life change might reflect genuine concern about practical consequences that deserve consideration, or it might arise from social pressure to maintain stability, even when change serves your authentic development. Learning to examine emotional responses with curiosity rather than immediately accepting or rejecting them helps ensure that your choices emerge from wisdom rather than unconscious reactivity. The existentialist approach to emotional regulation emphasizes accepting emotions as part of human experience while maintaining responsibility for how you respond to emotional states. This means neither suppressing difficult emotions nor being controlled by them, but rather developing capacity to feel fully while choosing your actions based on your values and long-term commitments. Community engagement provides another arena for existentialist practice. Rather than viewing social and political involvement as optional activities separate from personal development, existentialism recognizes that our individual authenticity is interconnected with the freedom and well-being of others. This might involve examining how your lifestyle choices affect others, considering what social changes you want to support through your actions and choices, or finding ways to contribute to causes that reflect your authentic values. The key principle is moving beyond mere opinion to actual engagement. Someone who values environmental protection but takes no concrete actions to reduce their environmental impact or support environmental causes is avoiding the responsibility that comes with their stated values. Authentic commitment requires aligning actions with expressed beliefs, even when such alignment involves sacrifice or inconvenience. Finally, practical existentialism involves developing what we might call meaning-making practices, regular activities that help you maintain connection with your deeper values and authentic commitments amid the distractions and pressures of daily life. This might include regular self-reflection, creative expression, meaningful conversations with trusted friends, meditation or contemplative practices, engagement with literature or art that challenges your assumptions, or service activities that connect you with causes larger than your immediate self-interest. These practices serve as antidotes to what existentialists call everydayness, the tendency to become absorbed in routine activities and social expectations, while losing touch with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and authentic living. They create space for the kind of reflection and recommitment that authentic existence requires. The goal of practical existentialism is not to eliminate uncertainty, difficulty, or conflict from life, but rather to approach these inevitable challenges with greater awareness, courage, and authenticity. It involves recognizing that every moment presents opportunities to choose who you become and what kind of world you help create through your actions, relationships, and commitments. Through consistent practice of authentic choice-making, you gradually develop what we might call existential integrity, a way of living that honors both your radical freedom and your profound responsibility for the consequences of that freedom. Part 10, the ongoing journey. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into existentialism's answer to life's most fundamental question, we find ourselves not with a neat resolution, but with an invitation to an ongoing journey of authentic living. The existentialist perspective on life's meaning is both profoundly simple and endlessly complex. Life's meaning is what you create through your authentic choices, relationships, and engagement with your freedom and responsibility. But this seemingly straightforward answer opens onto vast territories of human possibility that cannot be mapped once and followed forever. Instead, they must be explored continuously, with each day offering new opportunities to discover who you are becoming and what significance you choose to create. This ongoing nature of meaning-making represents one of existentialism's most challenging and liberating insights. Unlike philosophical or religious systems that promise to reveal life's ultimate purpose through study, faith, or enlightenment, existentialism suggests that meaning is not a destination to be reached, but a process to be lived. You don't create your life's meaning through a single moment of revelation or commitment, and then simply execute that predetermined plan. Instead, you create meaning continuously through the accumulation of choices, the evolution of relationships, and your ongoing response to changing circumstances and growing self-understanding. Consider how different this is from more traditional approaches to life's meaning. Someone following a religious path might believe they have discovered life's purpose through divine revelation or scriptural study and can now organize their life around fulfilling that purpose. Someone embracing a scientific worldview might believe that understanding natural laws or contributing to human knowledge provides ultimate meaning. Someone committed to a political cause might find life's significance in working towards social transformation. Existentialism doesn't necessarily reject these sources of meaning, but emphasizes that even these commitments require ongoing choice and authentic engagement to remain meaningful rather than becoming mere habit or social identity. The religious person must continually choose their faith rather than simply inheriting it culturally. The scientist must repeatedly commit to the pursuit of knowledge because they find it genuinely valuable, not just because it provides career advancement. The political activist must regularly examine whether their methods and goals still reflect their authentic convictions rather than group loyalty or personal ego. This ongoing quality of existential meaning-making creates what we might call the paradox of authentic living. The more seriously you take your freedom and responsibility, the more you realize how much you don't know about yourself, others, and the world around you. The more committed you become to authentic choice, the more aware you become of complexity and ambiguity inherent in most significant decisions. The more you practice existential principles, the more you discover new depths of human possibility and responsibility that you hadn't previously recognized. This can initially feel discouraging to people who approached existentialism hoping for clear answers and definitive guidance. But the ongoing nature of existential development is actually one of its greatest strengths because it means that no matter what mistakes you've made, what opportunities you've missed, or what inauthentic choices have shaped your past, you always retain the capacity to choose differently moving forward. Every moment offers fresh possibilities for authentic action. Every relationship provides new opportunities for genuine connection. Every challenge creates space for authentic response. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this ongoing quality through his famous assertion that humans are condemned to be free. This condemnation isn't a punishment, but a description of a human condition. We cannot escape the necessity of choosing, even when we try to avoid choice through conformity, distraction, or delegation of our decision-making to others. Even the choice to avoid choosing is itself a choice that shapes who we become. This means that as long as you're alive, you retain capacity and responsibility to create meaning through your responses to whatever circumstances you face. The ongoing journey of existential living involves developing what we might call authentic flexibility, the capacity to remain true to your core values while adapting your specific choices and strategies as circumstances change and your understanding deepens. This requires distinguishing between your fundamental commitments and particular ways you express those commitments, recognizing that authentic consistency often requires changing your actions while maintaining your deeper principles. Someone committed to social justice, for example, might express that commitment differently at various life stages and in different social contexts. As a young person, they might engage in protests and activism. As a parent, they might focus on raising children with strong moral awareness. As a professional, they might seek careers that advance justice within existing systems. As an elder, they might mentor younger activists or support causes financially. The specific actions change, but the underlying commitment to justice provides continuity and meaning throughout these transitions. This flexibility becomes particularly important during life's major transitions, career changes, relationship beginnings and endings, geographic moves, health challenges, parenthood, aging, and loss. These transitions often challenge existing meanings and require creating new forms of significance that honor both continuity with your past choices and adaptation to new circumstances. The existentialist approach to life transitions emphasizes viewing them as opportunities for renewed authenticity, rather than simply as problems to be solved or changes to be endured. A career transition becomes a chance to reassess what kind of work genuinely aligns with your values. The end of a relationship creates space to examine what you've learned about love, connection, and personal growth. A health challenge offers opportunities to reconsider what you value most and how you want to use whatever time and energy remain available to you. Aging deserves particular attention in existentialist thinking because it forces confrontation with changing capacities, increasing limitations, and approaching mortality. Many philosophical and cultural approaches to aging emphasize acceptance of decline and preparation for death. Existentialism suggests a more complex response, acknowledging realistic limitations while continuing to create meaning within whatever constraints you face. An older person who can no longer pursue physically demanding activities retains a capacity to choose how they respond to these limitations. They might discover new forms of creativity, deepen existing relationships, mentor younger people, or find meaning in contemplation and reflection that wasn't possible during busier life periods. The specific forms of meaning-making change, but the capacity to create significance through authentic choice continues as long as consciousness remains. This ongoing capacity for meaning creation also applies to reviewing past choices and experiences. Existentialism suggests that you cannot change what you've already done, but you can always change how you understand and respond to your personal history. Someone who made harmful choices in the past can find meaning through accepting responsibility, making amends where possible, and choosing different behaviors moving forward. Someone who experienced trauma or hardship can discover significance through how they integrate these experiences into their ongoing development, and perhaps use their understanding to help others facing similar challenges. The existentialist perspective on regret emphasizes learning and growth rather than self-condemnation or wishful thinking about alternative pasts. Regret becomes problematic when it prevents authentic engagement with present opportunities, but it serves positive functions when it provides information about your values and motivation for different choices. Someone who regrets not pursuing a creative passion might use that regret as motivation to begin creative work at whatever stage of life they currently inhabit. Someone who regrets harming others might allow that regret to deepen their commitment to more caring behavior in future relationships. The ongoing nature of existential meaning-making also illuminates the relationship between individual authenticity and social change. Your personal journey toward greater authenticity doesn't occur in isolation, but within communities, cultures, and historical contexts that both constrain and enable different possibilities for meaningful living. As you develop greater clarity about your own values and commitments, you naturally become more aware of social conditions that support or hinder others' capacity for authentic choice. This creates what we might call expanding circles of responsibility. Initially, existentialist practice might focus primarily on your personal choices and immediate relationships. As your understanding deepens, you begin to consider how your lifestyle choices affect others, how your professional activities contribute to social outcomes, and what role you want to play in addressing larger social challenges. This expansion doesn't require becoming a political activist, but it does involve recognizing the interconnection between personal authenticity and social justice. The global challenges of our time, climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, technological disruption, create new contexts within which individuals must work out their authentic responses. Someone committed to environmental stewardship must decide how to balance personal convenience with ecological responsibility. Someone valuing human dignity must determine how to respond to injustice and oppression in their own community and globally. These challenges don't have simple answers, but they require the kind of authentic engagement that existentialism promotes. The ongoing journey of existential living also involves developing what we might call comfortable uncertainty, the capacity to act decisively and live fully while acknowledging the limits of human knowledge and the unpredictability of outcomes. This involves accepting that many of life's most important questions don't have definitive answers, and that authentic living requires proceeding with incomplete information while remaining open to new understanding. This comfortable uncertainty becomes particularly important in our contemporary context, where rapid social change, information overload, and competing worldviews can create paralysis or premature closure around complex issues. The existentialist response is neither cynical relativism that abandons the search for meaning nor dogmatic certainty that refuses to acknowledge complexity. Instead, it involves committing fully to your best understanding while remaining open to growth and change as circumstances evolve and knowledge expands. Perhaps most importantly, the ongoing journey of existential living involves maintaining what we might call wonder and gratitude, appreciation for the extraordinary fact that conscious beings capable of creating meaning exist at all in what appears to be a largely unconscious universe. The capacity to experience beauty, form relationships, create art, pursue knowledge, show compassion, and ask fundamental questions about existence represents a remarkable phenomenon that deserves recognition and celebration even amid life's difficulties and limitations. This wonder doesn't require religious belief or metaphysical assumptions about cosmic purpose. It simply involves recognizing the improbable magnificence of consciousness, choice, and human connection as they have emerged through natural processes. Whether these capacities represent intentional creation, fortunate accident, or something beyond current understanding, Their existence provides a foundation for creating significance through how we choose to exercise them. As we conclude this exploration of existentialism's approach to life's meaning, the invitation is clear: to embrace the ongoing journey of authentic living with courage, responsibility, and appreciation for the extraordinary opportunity that conscious existence represents. The meaning of life, from this perspective, is not a riddle to be solved, but reality to be created through your choices, relationships, and responses to whatever circumstances you encounter. This creation of meaning is both your greatest freedom and your most profound responsibility. It offers no guarantees about outcomes, no promises about permanence, no escape from uncertainty and difficulty, but it provides something potentially more valuable: the recognition that you are not a passive victim of circumstances, but an active creator of significance, capable of finding and making meaning in whatever context you inhabit. The journey continues with each choice you make, each relationship you nurture, each response to challenge and opportunity. The meaning you create today becomes a foundation for tomorrow's possibilities, and the authenticity you practice now contributes to the ongoing human exploration of what it means to live fully and well. In this ongoing creation of significance, you join the broader human project of discovering what conscious beings can become when they take their freedom and responsibility seriously, and that participation itself represents one of the deepest forms of meaning available to human experience.